Today we're going to pull the engine on this 70 Chevelle. So what we're going to do first is disconnect the battery. Then we're going to come over here, take the air cleaner off, take the carburetor off, and then from there we're going to take the cap and wires off and pull the distributor so that it doesn't get damaged while we're taking it off. And then we'll come over here, take the radiator off. Alright, now we're going to take the coil off. I also disconnected here the gas linkage from the bracket. Bolt the two wires. This is the negative side. This goes to the distributor. Here's the other side. Goes over here. Just unscrew this screw over here and loosen the bracket itself. And the coil comes right out. And then we will take these two screws off and disconnect it. You know, when you take all these wires off, it might not be a bad idea, if you don't do this all the time, to label some of this stuff. Like this goes to the distributor, this goes to the oil pressure, here's the other side of the distributor. And that way you don't have to struggle later on when you're trying to put it back together. Now we're going to take the distributor cap off. Two screws, one here, one on the other side. Just like that. See, just put your screwdriver in here, push down and move it. And there's a bolt way in the back here, 9/16. Here it is. And just wiggle it up. Here it comes. There we go. Just like that. And here's the gears that go on the camshaft. The next thing we have to do is take the hoses off. So we'll disconnect this hose here, which goes right to the intake. Then we have these two water heater hoses. One goes to the intake, and you'll see it goes right over to the heater. And then we have the hose down here, goes to the water pump. You need to take that one off. And then there is a bottom hose down on the bottom. Oh, you'll see that as it goes across. And then we'll have to take off this top cover and also the plastic shroud, and then we'll come back and we'll take the fan off so it's out of the way. So let's do that next. Disconnect the hose and let the press stone come out. Just let it drain gently so it doesn't spill all over the place.
You'll see here that I left the wrenches on the bolts. These are 1/2-inch bolts here on the bracket that holds the radiator into place. There's also 2 bolts on the top of the shroud on each side that hold it to the bracket, and there's 2 little clips on the bottom, so you unscrew the 2 bolts and then you can just lift it straight up and out of the way. Now I left this here just for the photo. It shows that the shroud is pushed back onto the fan, and you just lift the radiator out from the position that it's in. Here is the radiator itself after it's all taken out, and here's the shroud pushed back on the fan, so you just sort of push it back toward that front and then take it off. Now here we have the fan itself. You'll see that it has 4 bolts holding it on, 1/2-inch bolts. And here we're taking the fan off the pulley, and there's the pulley itself from the water pump. The next item is the alternator. It is held on by 2 bolts. One on the top where it has that slot where you can adjust the tension on the belt. One on the bottom that tightens the whole thing down. Then there's 2 connectors on the back. The one on the bottom is just a little press in and pull out. The top one is a 7/16 nut that you unscrew, and then you can take the electrical connector off, and then the whole thing just comes off. Now it's on to the air conditioner. I have circled in yellow a bolt underneath the air conditioner that bolts it to the bracket, and then there's one circled in green that's on the slot, and that is used to increase the tension of the belt. Here's the overall view of the air conditioner, and you'll see the black hoses going to the rear. To remove the air conditioning hoses, there's a bolt here on this yellow arrow, so you just remove that, and the bracket will separate from the air conditioner. And then in green there's another bolt that holds it to the bracket that's bolted to the intake manifold. And then underneath there's 3 other bolts that hold another bracket, and all these are used to fasten the air conditioner to the engine. So you remove the air conditioning hoses and then gently remove the air conditioning from the car itself. The power steering unit is held on by 2 bolts. The one on the left has a 9/16 socket on it, and that bolts directly to the water pump. The one on the other side bolts to the block, and that bracket has a slot in it, and that allows you to increase or decrease the tension on the power steering pump. Now coming from the back of the pump, there's 2 hoses, and they will bolt directly to the power steering unit itself. Okay, now we'll go on the inside. You'll see this car is equipped with a 4-speed transmission with a Hurst shifter with a rubber boot and a metal bracket holding it to the floor of the car. You'll see here after we take all the screws out, that the imprint of the bracket that it made into the rug itself. But the whole thing needs to be taken out. Now there's 2 bolts here that hold the shifter lever to the shifting unit itself. Those have to be removed, and here they are removed. And at this point you'll be able to drop the transmission without interference from the shifting lever itself. In order to remove the transmission, you're going to have to remove the drive shaft, and it's connected to the rear end with 2 U-clamps, and they both have 1/2-inch nuts with washers on them. So after you take the nuts off, you can pry out the U-bolts. There's 2 of them, and then take a screwdriver and pry the universal joint away from the yoke of the rear end. And then from there you can lower the drive shaft and pull it out of the transmission. The typical installation on these V8 motors is there's an exhaust manifold located on each side of the engine, and that connects to the exhaust system. There's usually 3 nuts with washers that hold the flanges together. I usually spray these with WD-40 to loosen them up, because sometimes they can be pretty nasty to get these off. And I use a long socket and extension, and then in this last picture you can see that all the nuts are removed, and the exhaust system is ready to be disconnected from the manifold. This is a typical installation for the clutch linkage rod and the spring assembly. I have a red arrow pointing to the right, and that is toward the rear of the car, and that is the direction of the flow of this rod when you press the clutch pedal down. So that makes contact with the throwout bearing lever arm, which the throwout bearing then comes in contact with the pressure plate and relieves the pressure, so the car stops moving forward. At the same time, I have a green arrow pointed in the direction of the spring, and that is to constantly keep the throwout bearing away from the pressure plate. This picture shows the clutch linkage rod fully assembled and engaged with the throwout bearing lever arm. this picture shows that it has been disconnected. Now, when you want to disconnect the clutch pedal rod, there's on that red arrow, there's a little hole in that rod that has a cotter pin, and that goes directly into the metal bracket where the green arrow is pointed. Now, after you take that off, then there's a 1/2-inch nut that holds that assembly to the frame, and on the opposite side, where the green circle is, there's a metal ball that's bolted to the engine. With the assembly removed, I drew a little a blue ball here, and that is what's bolted to the motor, and that goes inside the tube. The green circle is where it's bolted to the frame, and then you see a little yellow J-hook in the upper right-hand corner. That is where the clutch pedal rod goes into the bracket. And then in the lower left-hand corner is a pink arrow, and that would be the direction of the motion that goes to the throwout bearing lever arm. On the passenger side of the motor is where the starter is. It's held in place with two 9/16 bolts. So after you take the bolts out, you can slide it out of the bell housing where the gear contacts the flywheel. And then there's 3 bolts up on the top, one main one that goes to the battery, and the other 2 that have to be removed from the solenoid before you can remove the starter from the car. The fuel pump is located on the front of the engine on the passenger side of the car. It makes it a lot easier to get at the motor mount bolts if you take this off. So there's a black hose coming from the gas tank on the lower part of the fuel pump, and then on the other side is a metal tube that goes up to the carburetor. And the fuel pump is bolted directly to the block with 2 9/16 bolts. The motor mounts are used to bolt the engine to the frame. It's also mounted in rubber, and it cuts the vibration down. You see I have a little green arrow that points to the bolt. It's way under there. Here's a little bit bigger picture of the same area. Now if we move over to the passenger side, I have the same bolt shown with a green arrow, and you see how much easier it is to gain access with the fuel pump removed. So I take a box wrench and put it on the nut, and then I go around to the back side with a socket and extension to remove the bolt itself. The first step in removing the transmission from the car is to remove the rubber transmission mount that is bolted to the cross member, and you use a socket extension to remove all 4 bolts. On the driver's side, there's 2 bolts that hold the cross member to the frame, and the same thing on the passenger side, there's 2 bolts. Now you notice here that the second bolt is twisted and we can't get it off. So what we're going to have to do is use the oxygen acetylene tanks and just cut these off.
Here's what we do when you can't get a bolt off. Make sure you turn all these on, adjust to make sure that it's all adjusted. Bolt up and cut it off. How are you doing over there? Okay, that's how you cut it off.
This is the configuration with the transmission unbolted from the cross member and the cross member unbolted from the frame. So the next step is to go over and disconnect the speedometer cable, which is located on the other side of the transmission. The next step in removing the transmission is to get a floor jack and put it underneath the oil pan. It's indicated here with a green arrow. So we lift up the whole configuration, and then at that point we can remove the emergency brake cable, which is indicated with a yellow arrow, And being that the cross member is unbolted from the frame, unbolted from the transmission, we can wiggle it out of position and then lower the transmission. At this point, there's 4 bolts that hold the transmission to the bell housing. They're indicated here with red arrows. With all the 4 bolts taken out, we can put a floor jack on the base of the transmission, which is circled here in blue. At that point, we can just take the weight of the transmission on the floor jack and wiggle the transmission out of the bell housing and then slowly let it down. With the transmission lowered on the jack, it's easy to slide it from underneath the car. Now, I have red arrows here that indicate where the transmission bolts directly to the bell housing. Now let's do the hood. There are 2 brackets, 1 on each side, and 2 9/16 bolts holding the hood to the bracket. But before I take this off, I use a hacksaw and I will scribe a line in the hood on both sides, on the forward side of the bracket. You'll see here the scribe line with the green arrow. Now this is so that I can put the hood back in exactly the same position as I took it off. It's easier to remove the hood with 2 people. The first person holds the hood in the up position while the second person goes around and takes off the 2 bolts on each hinge. Then the person in the front sort of moves over to the side and the other person holds it from the side, and you tip it down and lift it off the car. Here's our removal configuration. We have a cherry picker in position. We have the chain bolted onto the motor and it's connected to the cherry picker. So at this point, we'll begin.
Alright, here, we slowly lift the motor up. Make sure all these hoses are clear. Take that off. Okay, so since we don't have any room, I have to move the car back. It's going to clear, but barely. So just jack it up a little bit more. Now to clear. Roll the car back a little bit more. Let's give it about a yard. Okay.
Here we are, cleared from the car, still on the hoist, and here we have the motor stand in position, ready to go.
Alright, here is the bell housing. This is the clutch lever. This is where the transmission went. This is the throwout bearing. Here's the pressure plate in here with the ones with the teeth. And the clutch is behind there. So what we're going to do is take this bell housing off and take off the clutch and pull the flywheel, and then once we get the flywheel on, we'll be able to flywheel off, and we'll be able to put it on the engine stand.
To remove the bell housing, there are several bolts, and a few are indicated here with the green arrows. And when you look at this other picture, you'll see that they go all the way around the right side of the bell housing also. And on the back side, there's a couple bolts that hold the front pan. What this does is totally enclose the clutch area and protect it from the weather. Now with the bell housing removed, you'll see in the center the throwout bearing. This is what contacts with the pressure plate.
Here's the pressure plate. What happens is this throwout bearing right here, as you press the clutch, pushes forward like this, rides over here and pushes this in, releases the pressure, and then it stops the motion of the transmission. So by pushing this up and down, this presses right on here.
Here is the pressure plate bolted to the flywheel and can be removed with 6 bolts using an extension and a socket. Now here is the clutch, which is made as asbestos, and it rides between the pressure plate and the flywheel. Here's the flywheel bolted on with 6 bolts. Now to get this off, I used a pair of vice grips that I put on the ring gear to hold it from moving while I broke loose all 6 bolts. And here is the flywheel itself, and you'll notice the crankshaft from the engine. And here is the engine on the engine stand bolted to where the bell housing was located, and this gives you the opportunity to rotate the engine in any configuration to make it easier to do any kind of rebuilding.